Hi, I'm Ravi Mankikar. Welcome to Learnings. Today we are going to have a short discussion on the risk mitigation from cyber attacks and the cyber security framework as prescribed by the Reserve Bank of India. Here we go. The cooperative sector per se constitutes 5% of the overall banking sector. But being part of the financial sector, it also faces the threats which are imminent, where hackers use the aura of money, and to get that money they are always targeting these banks. Cooperative banks per se are perceived to be a bit weak as far as the security implementation is concerned, and in that context we need to really understand the need to have a good security setup where we can withstand the various threats which are emanating from the various quarters, and at the same time protect the money and repose the trust which the customers have in us. If we look at the security landscape and the readiness of the cooperative banks, I would say that most of the banks have put in the preliminary security measures, whatever are required to face the basic threats. As a bank, we would have taken care by putting in place the elementary security measures, like having the antivirus at the desktop levels, having a firewall at the perimeter level. But is that enough? What we need to really ensure is that we have taken care as a bank, we have taken care of the entire security landscape, right from the perimeter to the network, to the application, to the database, to the endpoints, and finally ensure that the critical assets are covered. And if we look at it, protecting the critical assets is more important than protecting the endpoints. But the endpoints are the most vulnerable areas where the hackers target the users. And when we look at the endpoints and the users, it is more important that the users are appropriately trained, made aware of the various threats, the various risk mitigation features which the organization is trying to put in place, and at the same time ensure that whatever they do not compromise on the security landscape of the organization. Now, to give a brief example, the easiest way to get into a system is to allure the user to open a link coming on an email. Once I'll click on that email, I really don't know whether that link is linked again at the background to a malicious software. And in the process, as a user, I could be downloading something onto my network which will tomorrow, later on, go on to prove that it is assisting the hacker. Now, if we look at the various entry points for hackers to get into the system, malware is one of the most common of the entry points. And how do malwares come in? A very common feature is emails or contaminated emails. We have phishing attacks. A phishing attack is where a purportedly genuine email is sent to a user, and the user thinks that it has come from a genuine source, opens the link, opens the attachment, and in the bargain downloads on his desktop a malicious software. Now, if the endpoint or the desktop is not adequately protected by the updated version of the antivirus, then the user has a risk of letting the malware infect the system. And to make sure that such infections do not happen, the user has to ensure that he does not open mails from unknown sources. Second, he does not respond to such mails by clicking on links that are possibly taking the user to unauthorized sites and where a hacker can get into the system. Updation of the patches is very important, and the organization has to ensure that an appropriate patch management system is in place to ensure that the patches at the desktop level and at the various device level which are used to protect the system, like firewalls or the antivirus, intrusion prevention systems, are updated and kept in readiness to face the latest threats. Banking is changing, and if we look at it, there is a big demand for the non-branch delivery channels to be used by the customers. Now, if we look at the present landscape, we find that about 30% of the customers use the non-branch delivery channels. But this is slowly changing. And the non-branch delivery channels, which includes the channels like ATMs, channels like mobile banking, channels like internet banking, IMPS, RTGS, e-commerce, POS, etc., are on the rise. Now, with the rise in the non-branch delivery channels, the access point to the bank and the customer's data is coming from various sources. Cooperative banks per se, other than those large banks, depend on other service providers to give them the source to give these kind of services to the customers. For example, the CBS could be from one vendor, the IMPS could be from another vendor, the mobile banking could be from the third vendor, the email services could be from the fourth vendor, and sometimes the integration of all this to provide a very secure, complete network is difficult for the bank to put in place. And this gives a huge gap where an hacker can exploit and get into the system. So it is very important that when the bank per se tries to ramp up its business channels and give the services on the non-branch delivery channels, it also needs to address the various threats which can arise from a customer trying to get into the system using the appropriate authentication and validation methodology. So from the application side, we need to ensure that the appropriate authentication and validations are in place. From the technology side, we need to ensure that the appropriate security measures are in place. And the security measures also mean that the channel in which the connection takes place is an HTTPS channel. That is a secure channel. It's an encapsulated channel, so that there is no possibility for a man-in-the-middle attack or some other source by which a hacker can intercept the transaction as it is happening. When we look at the various security products which need to be implemented, the foremost is the antivirus, because it starts from the desktop. Then we get at the users. So the users are generally monitored by what is called as the Active Directory. So the Active Directory enables the organization to control the usage of the desktop as well as the various applications and allow the users to only get into the system and use the products which the bank wants the user to use. This also ensures that the user is able to work on a need to do basis or a not to do basis, so that there is no digression into the system. We also need to implement what is called as the Privileged Identity Management System, that is a PIM solution. PIM solutions are generally put in place for the super users. Now, super users have access to the entire gamut of the applications as well as the databases. So, any access which is done by the super users need to be monitored to ensure that whatever actions they take are in line with the security policy of the bank. Because it is very important that if there is a compromise on a super user ID, then the hacker can get into the system and literally play havoc with the system. When we look at the network security also starts from the perimeter, where we need to have the appropriate access control at the router level. Then we also need to have the intrusion prevention system or the intrusion detection systems to ensure that there is no attempt of hacking. So we monitor the sources or the path from which the user is trying to get into the system. If the source is from an unknown region or from a region which is blacklisted, then it could be stopped at the entry level itself. This is very important, and banks need to put in place such kind of systems at the perimeter level to ensure that any user who is coming in from a source or an IP which is blacklisted does not reach the core systems. The banks also need to ensure that appropriate controls are put in at the application level. Now, when we talk of application, we could have a user ID, we could have a password. It is always better to have a two-factor authentication. Now, when we talk of two-factor authentication, what it also implies is that the bank puts in place a mechanism to authenticate the customer on the basis of what he knows, what he is, and what he has. And based on these combinations, it is able to identify that the login of the user is a valid user. Now we have various cases of impersonation. We have various cases of identity theft. We have various cases where we have SIMs which are swapped. Now the bank needs to be very careful when the non-branch delivery channels are used, because the person is not visible and the attack would come from a genuine person or it could come from a person who is impersonating the real customer. It has to put in place those kind of measures which can identify the genuineness of the customer and then only allow him to access the systems. Now, one of the most prudent ways of curtailing risks in a new registration is to put a cooling period. So when the bank ensures that a cooling period is implemented, it ensures that suppose a customer's ID is compromised and a new beneficiary is created, then the beneficiary cannot be given credit from the customer's account immediately. So in case the customer comes to know that there has been a compromise on his account, he should in normal course be getting an alert by way of email or by way of maybe SMS. If at that particular moment he knows that a beneficiary has been created in his account, which he has not done, he can inform the bank, and the bank can take care that because of the cooling period, disable that beneficiary so that the customer funds are protected. Once the cooling period is through, then we also can introduce a mechanism where for the, let's say, first 24 hours or the first 48 hours, a limited amount can be debited to the customer's account so that large funds cannot be transacted. This will also ensure that when a customer's account is compromised, there is not a large impact which could happen on the customer's account and the customer's money can be saved. When we look at the entire security landscape, let us identify the three main pillars which drive the landscape. We'll talk of people, we'll talk of processes, and we'll talk of technology. The most easy part is to implement technology. Then the most difficult part is to manage people. Because people have to understand the technology, they have to understand the processes, and a well-defined process with a well-trained user can also ensure that they supplement the features which have been incorporated in the technology. Now, when we look at the technology side, we'll find that there are various products which are coming out to mitigate the threats coming out from the various quarters. We'll have an IDS, we'll have an IPS, we'll have a firewall, we'll have an APT solution. So we'll find that there are so many solutions being provided by so many vendors, and then we need to correlate all these. And for this, the institution or the organization has to put in place what is called as a SIEM solution. That is a security and incident event management solution. What it also means that it has to have an appropriate security operations center, that is a SOC. Now what a SIM will do, there will be a logger in which it will pull the logs from all the devices which are configured onto the landscape, be it a SIM, be it a PIM, be it IDS, be it a firewall, be it a desktop, be it any of these devices. It will pull in all the logs into a logger, and from the logger they will start correlating the logs which are coming out into the system, and then try out whether there is a trend. And after analyzing these logs, it will be easy for the organization to find out that whether an attack is imminent or whether an attack has taken place, and then take appropriate mitigation measures based on the analysis which is done. Similarly, once this SIM is in place, there has to be the appropriate staff or appropriate resources who are trained into understanding the logs, who are trained in understanding to how to analyze the logs and to take meaning out of the logs so that appropriate precautions could be taken. Now, when we are talking of the security solutions, what is important for the bank to understand is what it is trying to protect. Now, when we are looking at the protection, typically what the priority is given to the critical assets. Now, when we speak of critical assets, we would look at the assets which are going to impact the business. So, on one hand, we look at the business criticality. Second, we look at the various applications and technology which the bank has put in place to support the business applications. And third, the security applications which the bank has put in place or which is required to put in place to protect the critical assets. Now, this has to be in harmony. The technology has to be in harmony to suit the business requirements. The security has to be in harmony to suit the IT assets, so that we ensure that they don't work in silos and they don't create gaps where a hacker can get into the system. Now, when we are looking at the various security products, we also need to ensure that the bank starts simplistically. That is, be simple. Don't try to go for very fancy stuff. Go for stuff or go for the products which are easy to implement, which are easy to configure, which are easy for the user to use. Because the more complex we try to build in, the more mistakes which can happen during configuration, and the more mistakes which happen in the system, the more prone the organization is for hacking. So we have to ensure that the simplicity of implementation, the simplicity of maintenance is used by the organization, and thereby we ensure that it covers its base. The most important aspect of such tools is we start from the basics, that is the desktop. Have an appropriate antivirus system in place. Now, if we look at it, no antivirus system will give you a complete solution. So look at a solution which covers most of the threats. Ensure that the various patches on antivirus software are updated. Make sure that the various patches on the operating system are also updated. It is also seen that as a cost-cutting measure, most of the banks do not refresh their hardware. I have seen that some of the banks are still working on XP as the operating system. And XP is one of the operating systems which has been phased out by Microsoft. And we do not get the operating system patches for that. This is creating one of the most open vulnerabilities which can be exploited. And many of the hacking attempts could happen on machines which are on the XP platform. So banks have to ensure that they upgrade these systems and bring in place the new systems, the new desktops with P7 or P8, with the Windows systems on the Windows 7 platform or the Windows 10 platform. Now, one of the reasons of the risks being high in the cooperative sector is because most of the banks do not have integration between the various applications and products which they have put in place at the business side. Now, if you look at it, core banking is one product. We will have another product for the payment systems like RTGS and EFT. We will have another product to take care of, let's say, the mobile banking. Then we have the IMPS. Then we have the internet banking. Then we have the SWIFT for forex transactions. It is very much necessary that there is an integration between all of these systems, so there is a seamless flow whenever a transaction happens touching most of the payment endpoints. Now, this will ensure that there is no man in the middle attack, which was seen in some of the cases which have recently happened, where the systems were bypassed and the transactions took place without the systems reaching the core banking system of the bank. Now, it is also important to ensure that the integration takes place at such a level where it gives out alerts in case of incomplete transactions. So we have to ensure that as a bank, appropriate integration have taken place between the various products which are in place. This also means that there has to be a synonymity between the processes which are adopted for the payments. It also means that we need to have appropriate authentication processes in place to authenticate the customer, to authenticate the transaction. We also need to have appropriate limits on transactions so that we know that there is no digression which is happening on the limits, and thereby mitigate on the amount of risk and reduce the risk in case of compromise on the customer's account. So when we look at a threat, many times it is difficult to identify whether the threat is real or whether it is a false positive. I'll give a simple example, that when we look at a request coming from a user that he has forgotten his password. Now, forgetting a password is the most common complaints which are received from the customers. Now, at that moment, when the password is reset, it has to be ensured that the attempts of resetting password does not exceed permissible limits. Because the moment it is found that someone is exceeding or trying to reset the password in the quantity which is exceeding the permissible limits, it could be someone who is trying to guess the password. Second, the password of a super user. If someone is trying to attempt to change the password frequently or try to reset the password frequently, that is a cause of concern, because super user passwords are supposed to be sacrosanct and they have to be guarded, because super user passwords give access to the entire system. So we have to ensure that any such requests coming in are properly analyzed, and the analysis is done based on the past history of the customer and the user. Most of the banks go in for two-factor authentication for authenticating the transaction. Now, when we talk of two-factor authentication, there could be cases where an SMS does not reach the customer. So banks could also have an alternative of providing the authenticating password on an alternate channel like email. So we could have email as an alternative to the SMS. Second, there are cases where the ATM card or details of the ATM card are also used to authenticate the transaction, where the customer is required to give the expiry date of the card or the last 3 digits of the card, etc., etc. And in this way, having multiple combinations of authenticity will help in ensuring that the wrong transactions are kept out of the system. Thank you.